Probably we have all been to the place where this great saint lived and moved, there in the south of Italy. Of course, it was much simpler when he was there. Probably also, if we have been there, we have been further down to Gargano, where we have the first recorded apparition and intervention of the Archangel himself in a well-preserved grotto. St. Pio was very much aware of the angelic world. As you know, he would use what we might call angel telecom to communicate with people. One day, when his custodian, as it were, his nurse, his bodyguard, Frère Alexio, was sleeping heavily when he should have been up to get him from the crowds as he was coming from church early on in the day, Padre Pio had to send his guardian angel to wake him up. And when he protested that his alarm clock hadn't functioned, Padre Pio, in his usual Padre Pio style, said, "You must get a stronger alarm clock. I am tired of sending my angel." This was the familiarity of these saints. The same thing happened actually with the Curé Vase, and there's a certain parallel between those two lives. They saw things, they knew things. Of course, that gift of knowing things does come through quite a bit in true church life. We have it in Ireland, one or two have it. Eddie Stone seems to have something of it. And these are not faked. What they have in common is that it is not man-made renewal or man-made flamboyancy and, as it were, self-advertisement. If that comes into it, it contaminates and deflects the blessing of God. That can happen. People on an ego trip, and a great podium can be a prayer group or a movement. Humility is the litmus test, and for that to be there needs to be, as it were, an eclipsing of oneself, which is precisely what we find in these two saints. Padre Pio would not appear on a picture until eventually ordered to, and something similar was also the case of Saint Jean-Marie Vianney. We only have a picture of him when he's lying dead. And actually we have one strong word in the authoritative biography of the Curé Vase by Monseigneur Trochu. After making some comment, he added, "Tant aimait-il s'effacer," so much did he love to efface himself. And when dismissing something, Padre Pio would obviously not say how he knew things, nor would Curé Vase. One day he let something out indicating that he knew more than he wanted to let on, and he was asked, "How do you know it?" And he just said, "Oh, I knew it." In other words, that's something what actually happens, it would seem, on several levels. It does happen, what we call the gift of knowledge, or la science. It just comes through when there's an open terrain. And I've seen it here and there at work in an authentic assembly of people who are genuinely open. Things start to move. And it can happen actually even in a small group, if it's authentic. On the other hand, there is a false renewal which is apparently glamorous, theatrical and successful. But is it? And if one scratches, one finds sometimes that it isn't. It's not enough either to create great beauty for God if things are not under his lordship. In practice, the will. But with regard to Padre Pio, he was fairly keen on getting to the will because he was handling all the time people's wills. And he knew their state precisely because of this gift of knowledge. And so he would not play around with an easy absolution, and actually he's known to have criticized those who did. He talks about squandering the precious blood. In other words, giving easy absolution without any kind of hope of change. If one gets into that mode, one is actually using God as a slot machine, and that can be happening. And worse still, one can actually be using confession almost as a permission to go on. And that is going to lead to a double problem. The conscience no longer after a while will react, and also the will not engage with the divine will, and therefore will not have intimacy as in a marriage. If after a while there is no communication of will between spouses, that's the beginning of a cancer in that marriage, and it can actually eventually kill it. And in that context, I would like to make a little aside linked with this gospel that we've had with regard to throttling. One of the categories with regard to the seed was that which fell in thorny ground. And the Lord explains, because we have the two parts of the gospel in this today, the explanation as well, that it's to do with being choked by worries, concerns, pleasures, and in general, what is out there. It's actually very contemporary, the list of what throttles. I can read it again. But as they go on their way, they are choked by the worries and riches and pleasures of life and do not reach maturity. Well, there's a parallel. I get quite a few people coming to me with something similar to this. There is no communication anymore. His attention is going into either a laptop or a smartphone. I can't compete. And I feel that when he's there, I'm not the center of his attention. One can take it once, one can take it twice, but then when it's habitual, it's the beginning of a real problem in the marriage. Now, multiply that by all the people that one is engaging with in the world who might have a similar problem, we're in serious trouble. I was celebrating actually earlier today in Moor Hall Lodge, and about 3 times one was competing with a loud mobile phone going off. And at one point actually there was somebody answering it, I think, audibly. Now, we think this is normal. Is it? It means by now that actually people are incapable of being unavailable. They are just not capable of not being engaged potentially with what is for them reality. Now, when it comes to our God, something of that also can come into it. Because if one compares the mind, and therefore also the soul, which is free of anything coming at it in an artificial way, the person living in nature, or actually for that matter the person in complete control of anything to do with the technology of this world, who just hasn't got it on for a long, long time, with the person who is perpetually engaged, then there is something different in the deepest level of the person. It's rather similar to what happens if one cuts up a body of 2 people after they've died. I know this from a person who was studying the whole thing in Dublin. And they were shown 2 bodies as part of their training. One was a non-smoker and the other was a smoker. And even though on the outside the 2 bodies looked something similar in death, inside there was a world of difference. And the smoker has a very, very, very damaged, profoundly damaged and actually ugly interior. Well, something of that is actually the case of a person who is, as it were, smoking technology, the cybersphere, the virtual, heavily, and is therefore psychologically addicted to it. Is that person, when it comes to prayer, going to be totally available to something which is so discreet that we can't even see or hear it? Now that's what we're up against. So do you see how by now it is very difficult for God to get through to either correct a soul or to call a soul? Any work with regard to vocations is extremely hampered, let alone what one might do with any vocation that might turn up. Where does one send one? Fortunately in Ireland we have now the valid alternative of the Dominicans, because they're a great bunch growing all the time and all wanting the real thing. Therefore they uphold each other and they have fellowship. It's much safer than going to a monastery with only one novice and eventually having to be a nurse for older people. With regard to Padre Pio, he was in this realm also aware of what sin leads to in the beyond. So much so that he is known to have muttered one time with regard to what happens when he is at the altar. Oh, because somebody was asking about the holy souls. If you only knew how many souls climb this mountain when I'm at the altar and pull at my chasuble, you would be amazed. And he gave some idea of the number. It was actually colossal. They were all wanting a bit. And he knew it. And that would also explain partly his length of celebration, because he would have a very, very, very long pause at the two mementos, one for the living and one for the dead. He was asked eventually by his superiors to move along, to speed up, but still it was always about 2 hours, and people would flock to be at the experience of Calvary. It was different. It was just purely God, no human at all. And the graces were massive. But then he knew why people were getting into trouble on the other side, partly because also they would come back. There are many stories told of things that happened with regard to encounters with the souls in purgatory, deceased brethren and the like. Cite one amongst many. He was in church one day and there was a novice behind there polishing away at the big brass candles at the high altar. And he was a bit surprised at that time of the day what was going on here. And it turned out the soul was long dead. And it was a long dead novice who had been negligent in the duties that he had, and he was having to make up for it on the spot where actually it had happened. And apparently that can happen, that souls can be there where they have actually done harm. And then you'd have also people who are long dead, fathers who would be coming to him in trouble. And therefore he knew the demands with regard to purgatory. We think it's pretty automatic. Well, we've got another thing coming. Because if we know what the purity of the Blessed Trinity is, then we will realize that it's not that easy to come close. And we wouldn't want to. There's a lot of grime to be burnt out before we get that far. The important thing is that we don't go the wrong way afterwards. But then to presume that it's easy access, because even Padre Pio apparently was afraid that people were going to call him a saint and not pray for him, and he was warning them not to do that, and he knew why. And actually, apparently, he did have a tiny, tiny time in purgatory himself. It's interesting, if somebody like that actually can have to have something purged out. It might have been because of his gruff, I don't know, but he was very clear on the way he said things. Maybe it's, I don't know, it could have been something like that. But anyway, that was Padre Pio. With regard to St Michael, I was just actually reading yesterday how there had been, from people who are in the know, a report about certain things and a certain amount of conversation by letter going on with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And it was stuff coming out through the mystical experiences of this and that and knowledge of what was going on. And they were citing the question of what Leo XIII had been aware of, that strange experience he had, and then also, this is less known, but also St Pius X, because just before dying he had seen and known things also which were quite stunning. Of course the Vatican knew about it. So when they heard these things coming through, they were taking seriously, and also the question of the intervention of St Michael and how he's been cast aside and it's left open a certain vulnerability on the part of the Church with regard to things going wrong. So there has been a desire, but very discreet, from the part of certain popes, and even discreetly the Vatican itself, that actually that should be re-established where possible, because of the power of that prayer at the end of Mass. It is something which acts as a barrage. But also for us, because, and I go back to where I started and I finish here, if we're not aware of the invisible world, and also the contamination that our immortal soul is exposed to by easy circulating in a very dangerous and contaminated cybersphere a lot, then we've got to be very careful, because without realizing it, we're being profoundly damaged on two levels. Being hyped up more than our soul and our mind is made for, and therefore unable to be accessible to the still small voice, not workable upon by grace, because we're dumbed and dulled, but also because too many images of a certain sort condition the soul through the imagination, because that's where we're going to be drained into. We're going to be looking mentally at that which is our reality, our virtual reality, far removed from that which was that of all the saints, including Padre Pio, and all the men of God who were not contaminated by anything artificial. Now we have new challenges, and don't think that we're stronger than those who went before us. Every time you are about to engage with the cybersphere, remember this parable and think now, do I want to be choked? Too many words make us dull to the power of a word and to the power of silence. But also it's handing over time. It's addictive, we don't see the time going. So I would suggest that you instinctively invoke the Holy Spirit every time you switch on anything which gives you access to the cybersphere. Lord, I want to hear you, and I can't hear you against all these voices which are choking my soul.